Hello, everyone. Welcome back to this little reaction video, I guess. Basically, I'm going to react to this clip from Tech Deals because I feel like this is a very good topic that's just not talked about enough in the PC gaming space, especially for a lot of these new products that are coming down the line. So let's go ahead and hop into it and just do this live reaction. Here we go.
And I think the problem is a lot of people just don't understand what a deal is. A deal doesn't necessarily mean low price. There are no low prices in PC gaming these days. We covered this last week when we talked about the pre-builts.
Yeah.
And we basically said that the $1,300 price point was like the bare minimum starter.
I want to pause right there for a second. $1,300 being the bare minimum to start off with. Yeah, he's actually right. So let me explain. I have a background of working with Micro Center previously, and I now work in Geek Squad, which is the repair arm of Best Buy. And just from the pre-builds I've seen alone, it's interesting how, because of the way the market is right now, getting an entry-level system into gaming is definitely very challenging. And because the used market is in just as much fluctuation thanks to things like inflation, crypto mining, bad shipping times, and then of course with new products, supply chain issues that won't really resolve themselves until the second half of 2022. If you were looking to buy a system for cheaper than that, you're effectively putting yourself in a position where if you are planning on playing any new AAA titles, good freaking luck beyond 2023 getting them to run at 60 FPS. And by the way, that's at 1080p. I'm not even talking 1440p or 4K. But I want to continue with this video because I'm already curious as to where he's going to go with this.
So what else happened in 2021? Moving on from that, so Alder Lake launched. Alder Lake is impressive. It's the first CPU I've been impressed with from Intel for a couple of years. AMD didn't launch a CPU this year. They launched Zen 3 last year, although it finally became available this year. It actually, because I don't know if you remember back at the beginning of the year, but none of the Zen 3 5000 series chips were in stock for the first 4 or 5 months of the year.
He's right about this because when I worked at Micro Center up until February of 2021, even by then, if you wanted, let's say, anything above a 5800X, you had to go stand in line when those 5900s and 5950s came in. And let me tell you, making sure they were getting sold to people who were actually going to use them was still just as challenging as it was to keep GPUs out of the hands of scalpers. And honestly, watching it and also being involved in it was just insane. But like the bottom line is that like it wasn't uncommon to get like 30, even sometimes 40, even 50 people standing outside waiting to get one of these, 12 core or 16 core chips. And it really wasn't until about May of that calendar year when finally they started coming in enough that you could say, okay, yes, we have these in stock, and you don't need like a voucher or any special reservation to be able to get one.
I remember.
But then they became in stock.
They did.
And then there have been some deals on Zen 3 chips recently.
They have.
Although I would argue that just like the CPUs, you'd have been better off paying $600, $50 over retail for a 5900X when it launched in 2020 than to pay $500 for one today, a year later. Because whatever your use case is, it will reach end of life for you at the same time, regardless of when you bought it.
See, and he's also correct about this too, because especially, again, we have to think about what is the average user going to get into. Typically, when people get into PC gaming, they have a certain set of games that they want to go for, right? And basically, over time, as more studios release new AAA titles, especially, that's when, if the person really is into AAA gaming, then this becomes more pertinent to them than, quite frankly, the person who's not as interested in those and would prefer, like, maybe esports titles or indie titles of some kind. AAA games are always developed with the baseline of the consoles in mind. If a console that's sitting at $500 is performing exactly the same as a mid-range gaming PC that's sitting at almost $1,800, I mean, it's pretty easy to like say, okay, what's the better deal at that point for the person if they're just simply gaming? Well, that's a no freaking duh. But the desktop has the advantage that basically it is much easier to do other things besides just game, right? So then now you're getting into a whole thing of, okay, what is the workload? What are the individual needs of the person? The consoles themselves end up being the better deal if all you're doing is gaming. You got to think about your needs when you think about this stuff. And since more people especially are trying to game with PC games more ever than before, and then on top of that also want to do content creation more so than ever before, then yeah, if you're one of those people, you got to ask yourself, what are you doing? Why am I doing that?
So let's take Bob, Stuart, and Kevin, our favorite minions. Bob is a super heavy user, upgrades all the time, multitasks multiple monitors, always wants to be on the bleeding edge, and he keeps his CPUs only 2 years because he's always just upgrading because he needs a powerful machine because he's really busy with what's going on. If he keeps his CPUs to where they're 2 years old, if he had paid over retail for it a year ago, then he still has a year left in it. Mm-hmm. That would be 2 years. Mm-hmm. Him keeping it, the CPU reaches 2 years from its launch date, no matter when you bought it. If you went out today and bought this Phenom 2 from AMD today, guess what? It's an 11-year-old CPU. It doesn't matter that it's new to you today. It launched 11 years ago. So the Zen 3 chips launched in 2020, and they will always have launched in 2020, no matter when you buy one.
Correct.
So if he buys it today for $500, he gets it for 20% off, 18% off. But if he upgrades every 2 years, then he's either trailing by a year if he keeps it 2 years, because then it's really 3 years old when he gets rid of it.
Correct.
Or he only has a year of life in it. Well, what's a better deal? A $600 CPU that you keep for 2 years, or a $500 CPU you keep for 1 year?
Well,
If I have, you have to explain that, then there's just no thinking going on. Now, that's Bob. Let's talk about Stuart. Stuart's in the middle. Stuart is mainstream, middle of the road. He likes to buy a bit premium, but he likes to keep it a little bit longer, and he's willing to just compromise a little bit so that he gets more than 2 years out of his CPUs.
Let me just say this, especially for the CPU market, what he's saying is absolutely 100% correct. If you are somebody who video games, most of the time, my experience when I was working at Micro Center, where I am currently working, and also just talking with people in general, is that typically if they buy a system strictly for gaming, they want to keep it running for at least 3 to 4 years. Bare minimum. Most people normally don't want to make upgrades every 2 years. So if you're changing your system, the specs of your system out, bare minimum, every 3 to 4 years, so that way you can try to keep up with the latest titles, then even then, something like a 5900X compared to a 5800X is still a better value overall, because again, you are getting more of those cores. Because let's break this down for a second, right? Let's look at the current pricing versus what each of those individual chips launched for. And I use Micro Center as my baseline just because in terms of pricing for CPUs overall, Micro Center has some of the best because number one, they're an official retail partner with AMD. Number two, Intel, even though they're not an official retail partner, they are on good enough terms that in general, because of the bulk they buy, Intel actually gets an automatic discount up front at the door that no other electronics retailer gets, not even Newegg. So generally speaking, that's why, especially with these Alder Lake chips, when they've only been out for less than 3 months, and they're already on a significant discount at Micro Center, Yeah, it's more than just competition, ladies and gentlemen. It's also because of the contractual deals that Micro Center has. Like, Micro Center is a more powerful figure in the PC gaming space than most people realize, and also in the do-it-yourself realm as well. So, but let's not get into that. Let's get into the pricing. Okay. So right now, 5800X, $329 at Micro Center. Now, let's look at the 5900X. If you're one of those people that's upgrading every 3 to 4 years, so 330 for 5800X. All right, so let's pull out the calculator so we can illustrate what we're talking about here. All right, so 330, and now tax is going to vary from state to state, but the average sales tax rate in most states is 8%. So we're going to do it that way. So if we look at that, then basically here after tax is how much you're actually paying for. Okay, now let's see exactly how much you would be spending once you get to that 3 to 4 year period. This is what you get. So we're going to set it for the parameter of 4 years, because 25%, it's a nice little ratio there. So divide that by 4, and this is what we get. That means you're spending $89.10 per year of using this CPU effectively. Okay, so that's on that one. Now, what about the 5900X? Hey, it's $500 right now. Okay, so $499, and then we're going to calculate the tax, and there you go. Now let's divide that by 4. So for literally what amounts to almost an extra $50 per year, you get 4 extra cores, 8 extra threads, and a CPU that's going to last you those 3 to 4 years just fine. Because this 8 core here, if you try to make it last that long, then you're going to be turning down some settings in some of those titles. And especially if you're someone who wants the quality over the function, then yeah, that's not going to be a good deal. Because here's what's going to happen. You're probably going to get somewhere within your 2nd or 3rd year and say, oh gee, this wasn't enough, right? So then your 330 that you were originally only going to spend, then added on the cost of a CPU from Zen 4 or even Meteor Lake, or sorry, Raptor Lake, which is the next one from Intel. I mean, the price tiering's not going to be that different, so which means that you're still going to be, especially if you just go to the one tier above it, you're still going to be paying the $500. And then you probably would have to then do a similar thing over again. And so then when you break it down over a 10-year period, who is faring better at the end of the day from a value perspective? The guy who bought the 5900X or the guy who bought the 5800X? I'll let you figure that one out on your own.
He likes to buy a new CPU and keep it 3 or 4 years. He wants premium experience the day he buys it, but then he's okay to soften his expectations in order to get more value out of it. Well, let's use 4 years just for nice round numbers. If he bought it for $600 a year ago, 4 years from that point, $600 divided by 4 is $150.
Correct.
Okay. If he bought it today, it's 3 years because the CPU didn't just become new today. I mean, if he's keeping it to that point in the life cycle of computers, then
So it's $200.
well, it's $500 divided by 3.
Oh, well, okay.
And $500 divided by 3 is $166. It's still cheaper for him to have bought it a year ago for over retail than today at a discount.
Correct.
Well,
then you got to use it and enjoy it.
And then you got to use it and enjoy it for your this stuff. The CPUs and GPUs do not drop in price by enough in a year. I keep getting asked this question. Oh, I'm thinking of finally upgrading my graphics card. Which one do I buy? The one a year ago, not now. Don't buy in the middle of a life cycle. Buy when they launch. When the 40 series comes out, buy it. Well, I want to think about it and wait for a deal and see if I can. Did the 20 series put the mining and the 30 series aside.
Right.
Did the 20 series ever get substantially cheaper during its life?
No,
It might have dropped $100.
that's not substantially though.
The 2060 launched for $349, and after a year or so, it dropped to $299. So it dropped $50 halfway through its life. Whoop-de frickin' do.
See, and this is also another good point too, is that especially from the air quote brand new value proposition standpoint, like this is way more true with GPUs than it is with CPUs with this part that I'm going to talk about. With GPUs, typically, if you're always looking for value proposition with those things, yeah, never buy in the middle of a life cycle of those, because what's going to end up happening is you're going to either end up in a situation like we are now, where basically MSRP just doesn't exist, and quite frankly, you're paying almost double the cost in most cases, or you wait until that series is about to come to a close, and then that's when any leftover stock or inventory that is available gets reduced in preparation for the next generation, and you buy up then your value proposition goes up quite a bit actually, because that, you know, like a good example of this was with the Pascal cards, right? Because when the GTX 1080 Ti especially launched, it launched for $700. That was its MSRP. Here's the thing though. It didn't say that MSRP for almost the first year of its life, because of the crypto craze that was going on then. Plus, on top of that, retailers and a lot of people in the supply chain were taking advantage of that situation and raising their own prices, which to an extent was the correct thing to do, but to some extent a little overdone. But I digress on that. I don't want to talk about that. What I want to mainly focus on is the fact that that card then skyrocketed because of everything going on to almost $1,100. So effectively, what a 2080 Ti at launch was going to be. Here's the catch, though. The catch is that if you waited out all that stuff till almost the very tail end of Pascal's life, all of a sudden, all those cards then started dropping under $700. And that meant you could go out for like $600 average-ish and buy a 1440p card effectively. Because that card, even today, still runs at 1440p 60, albeit you've got to adjust some settings to make sure that you don't totally bottleneck the card. But if you're okay with that, then that is your 1440p card. Otherwise, that 1080 Ti is a great high refresh, high settings 1080p GPU. And basically, if you had bought it in 2018, 2019, then you basically are able to keep that card up until the end of this year. This is and this is what I'm saying, because why? How many years is that from when that crypto cycle ended to now? It is going to be almost 4 years. So which means that 1080 Ti, if all you were doing was 1080p gaming, it aged you very, very well, and you chose a card that was fantastic. But if you were looking to do 1440p and above, that card, while it was nice to have, probably wasn't the best thing to choose. Because quite frankly, gaming for 1440p and 4K has only gotten more intense since then, which is the usual progression. So, that's the value proposition with GPUs. Now, what about the CPU side? Well, again, the CPU side, what if you were one of those people that had bought a 8700K, let's say, for instance, right? Because remember, when that 1080 Ti came out, the 8700K was one of the more powerful CPUs to get. How well did that 8700K age? Not very well. Because one, 8700Ks held their pricing long term, like way better than the 2700X did. But the problem is the 6 cores, 12 threads, albeit though they ran faster than the Zen Plus chips did, And a lot of titles that are very demanding, where there's a lot of rendering going on, like Cyberpunk, yeah, no, that chip, it just wasn't going to age well. Because now there's games coming out that require those 8 cores and 16 threads. So if you had gotten a 2700X, you would have been gaming just fine all the way up until the end of last year. And now you do need to consider upgrading, but to what? Well, you don't go 8 core to 8 core. Now you should be thinking about a 5900X. So either going to 12 cores, but if you want my personal opinion, from a value proposition standpoint, go to 5950X. Get the full 16 cores, get your 32 threads, and then that way you're sitting with a CPU that will last you a little while. Why? Because even though you're paying almost $700 to $750, depending on who you're going with, for what effectively is a 16 core model that is almost workstation like in its behavior, it's still really good at gaming and very competitive with a large swath of Intel's offerings. So if you had bought that 5950X, even at its $800 MSRP, when you were upgrading from whatever previous Zen system you had, that chip is going to age well. Because you went for the premium thing and you're saying, I don't want to upgrade just yet. And I want to keep it a long time. From a value proposition standpoint, CPUs always age better than GPUs. But you've got to define what your needs are.
The 2080 Ti never dropped in price.
No.
In fact, 2080 Ti's today are basically going for what they were new in 2018.
Exactly.
3 years ago.
Yes and no. It depends on which part of the used market you're in. But in general, they are starting to come back down because 2080 Ti's are not as good for the mining as a lot of the 30 series cards are. So you can start snagging 2080 Ti's for like $900 and even $850 if you like get it on a really good eBay auction and such. Now, to be fair though, I don't think that's going to be a lot of people, but the good news is that there's a lot more sellers out there that are trying to offload those cards. And quite frankly, some of them have been selling. I've seen on hardware, the subreddit hardware swap, I've seen some of them going for like $700, $750 on average. I mean, that's not, in my opinion, for something that is about the same performance level as a 3070. So let's say you're doing 1440p. Let me just put that out there. So if you're doing 1440p, getting a card that's about the performance of a 3070 and has more VRAM, by the way, and a bigger memory bus as well, dude, that's fantastic. Forget the better ray tracing available on the 3070 and everything. It's not really going to matter because the number of RT cores that are available, sorry, the Tensor cores, excuse me, I get that and Radeon mixed up. But the Tensor cores that are available are going to be, because there's a large number of them on the 2080 Ti, it's going to basically be almost as good, if not about the same, as a 3060 Ti. And a 3060 Ti is still in the same ballpark as a 3070, especially the ones that are, use a higher power threshold. So is that a bad deal? Well, again, it depends on what your needs are. If you're staying at 1440p, the answer is no.
Which, granted, is mining and a few other things when it is what it is. Then normally they wouldn't be at the moment. They would. That's crazy. So, Stuart is better off having bought it at launch. Let's talk about Kevin. Kevin is kind of an interesting guy because Kevin figures he'll buy top of the line and keep it until it's entry level. And then buy top of the line and keep it until it's entry level. I don't agree with that philosophy, but a lot of people do it. So he wants to keep it 6 years.
$100 a year?
It's the same cost whether he bought it at launch for $600 or today for $500. Because 6 years divided by 600 is 100, and 5 years divided by 500 is 100. None of them benefited by waiting.
Yeah, and that's the exact point. Good example of this was when I worked at Micro Center. We had a gentleman that came in that had built a system back when Zen 1 came out. The chip this was his configuration. He had a X3 an MSI X370 board that had a Ryzen 7 1700X in it with 32 gigabytes of 3200 RAM, and the card he originally had put in that system was, I believe, I think he said a 1070, I want to say it was at the time. And so what ended up happening was he came into Micro Center because he needed to, and granted, this was January of last calendar year, he needed to basically just upgrade his system because while his power supply was like, I think he said 1,000 watts, he made the horrible mistake of upgrading the GPU first. And so he was trying to play Cyberpunk with a 3080 in that thing, but he couldn't because his 1700X kept frame dropping constantly due to the fact that the cores themselves not so much running fast enough, but rather being able to handle the bandwidth requirements that Cyberpunk requires. So he was running into a bit of a situation there. We didn't have any Ryzen 5000 chips, and the only other thing we had at that time was the Intel 10th and a couple of 11th gen SKUs that were just starting to come in. The good news is at that time we had tons of Zen 2. And so what ended up happening was we did the research and we found out his motherboard that he paid, I think it was like $170 at the time for. We found out that his motherboard actually supported the Ryzen 9 from Zen 2. And so then that's when I realized, oh, this guy's actually onto something good. So I asked him, I said, that 3080 you have, are you going to be gaming at 1440p only or 1080p and, keeping that for at least several years? He goes, yeah. He said, I would rather be able to keep my GPU for at least 3 years. I said, all right. I said, then your 32 gigabytes of RAM is fine. Your 3080 is fine since you're not going above 1440p. I said, but the biggest favor you can do for yourself is just simply, I said, you don't have to switch out the motherboard, but get the 3900X. Because at that time, that 3900X was almost, I think, like $390 or something like that. And I said to him, I said, make sure you flash the board first and then go from there, right? For him, that's an okay deal. Because the 3900X is going to allow him to game without any bottleneck, and he gets a few extra cores out of it for background tasks and such. So from a value proposition standpoint, by getting a CPU that by that point was almost 2 years old, oh, what a fantastic deal. You can't complain, right? For him it was, but that's only because it seemed like a lower price. But because he's one of these people who bought long-term at the end, he's still, at the end of the day, still getting the same use out of it that all the other users that we're talking about here are getting, right? Because, so at $400, right? $432, right? How much did the 5900X launch for originally? Well, $500, right? Yeah. So we, wrong thing. If we run the calculations, so let's see here. So for $540, if he had bought it at its MSRP value, right, when it launched in 2019, and he decides, I'm going to keep it the usual 4 years. Sorry, not 4. 5. Let's just do the number 6, right? So that's how much he paid. But now waiting until it's $390. And here's the thing, that 3900X, sure, it'll last him 3 to 4 years, but that's probably about it, let's be honest. He still loses a little. Look at that. Even if we give him the benefit of the doubt, look how much he's actually losing. He's literally losing $7.50 per year because he waited so long to upgrade. This is one of the reasons why you have to be careful with these kind of what appears like bargains. Long-term calculation or long-term usage should require long-term calculation, which requires long-term deals. So the idea of a deal, again, is going to be relative to what your needs are, but sometimes what appears as a deal isn't always a deal. Again, lower prices don't always dictate that.
No.
So when everybody gets all excited going, Ryzen 9 5900X is finally $499. Okay. It took a year to get there.
Mm-hmm.
Why didn't you all buy it when it launched? Well, they were going for over retail for $600. Yeah. That was actually fair. That's absurd. I'm not doing that.
Okay.
Yeah, I heard that all the freaking time, and I just told people, it's like, look, do you want to actually keep your CPU for a while, or do you actually just not care at this point? Take your pick. You can't have your cake and eat it too. It just doesn't work that way when you're buying computer parts. To me, a lot of people just say this stupid stuff because in their mind, they've bought into the marketing, and instead of actually sitting down, crunching the numbers, running the figures, figuring out what their individual needs are, stupid stuff like this comes up all the freaking time.
I understand the emotional logic people make. I get that people go, well, this price is $50 above retail and this price is $50 below retail, so this is a ripoff and this is a deal. You know what's interesting? Cars do the same thing. Mm-hmm. They tend to discount vehicles, offer rebates, cash back, or 0% financing at the end of the year. Right now, Ford is doing 0% financing, for example, on their F-150s, on their 2021s.
Yeah,
With the 2022s rolling in.
correct.
You could have bought a 2021 in 2020 and already had it a year. And while they weren't offering 0% at the time, when you consider that 3 years on a vehicle you bought in 2020 versus 3 years on a vehicle you bought now, they're not the same thing when you get to the end.
Correct.
So buying at the end of the model year, oh, you get these discounts, it's cheaper. No, because the minute you drive it off the lot, it's already a full year old.
Yep.
And in 1 year's time after you drove it off the lot, 2023s will be out and it's now 2 years old. Mm-hmm. And so your cheaper price, I actually have come to the realization after multiple vehicles and having looked at this, you're better off paying a bit more to get the next model, to get a 2022 than you are to get last year's model. Well, I saved $3,000. Did you now? When you go to trade it in a couple of years, no, you didn't. It looks like it, but you didn't because the residual value.
Correct.
So,
Yeah, and that's another thing too. Residual value versus depreciation never lines up the way you would think it would if you're looking at only the surface level stuff immediately. But once you actually sit down and crunch the numbers, depreciation will always affect lower end residual value stuff much more from a percentage standpoint than the higher end.
not to mention the fact that it's not really true today because nothing's staying on lots, but in normal times, at the end of the model year, some of the ones left on the lots at the end of the year have literally been sitting on the lot 6 months, meaning it was built in March or April, and it's had 300 miles driven on it occasionally on 450 test drives while it's sat out there not moving. You don't want that vehicle.
No. No, you don't want that.
So the one you want is the one they just pulled off the truck
Yes.
that was built last week.
Yes.
As long as it's not a Monday or a Friday.
Oh, I know, Friday.
We got some super chats?
We do.
Look,
Yeah, let me just chime in and say he's not wrong about the Monday Friday thing. Trust me. There's even in my area where I live, there's something weird with it when it comes to like pricing and such. And so I have found that the best day of the week, if you want the best price possible and the best possible vehicle to get when you're buying a brand new vehicle, go on a freaking Tuesday. I can't explain why.
Let's get to those in a second. Let's finish 2021. What else happened in 2021? Oh, yeah. Cryptocurrency went absolutely insane.
It did go nuts.
GPUs became completely unavailable. And the entire concept of both budget and mid-range gaming PCs got
Disappeared.
it might as well have been the Death Star. Well, that's going to get blown up. I mean, if they ever make another Star Wars movie and there's another Death Star in it, you could just say, we're going to be treated to another Death Star explosion by the end of this. How do you know that? Been to this show before. That's just what they do.
What's it called? Limit Breaker?
That's so yeah. The whole thing. In fact, I got a comment that I'm going to respond to here. We got several comments we're going to respond to, where people are like, "Well, how come Tech Deals doesn't do deals anymore?" And I think the problem is a lot of people just don't understand what a deal is. A deal doesn't necessarily mean low price. There are no low prices in PC gaming these days. We covered this last week when we talked about the pre-builts.
Yeah.
And we basically said that the $1,300 price point was like the bare minimum starter. And ideally you went up from there. But if you don't have that much to spend, just don't.
Console.
Yeah, that's it. There's nothing. You're literally wasting your money to buy anything less than those price points. And really you want to be at the $2,000 price point. So if
Yes.
anybody watching goes, well, I want to put together a machine. Great. Do you have $2,000? I've got $800. Well, then you're not putting together a computer. But no, you're not.
Buy a console and you can put some money in your pocket.
Yeah, there's nothing worth buying at those prices. That's just the reality of the market. This isn't me saying, well, you should all be rich and spend premium money. This is dealing with what is rather than what we wish it was. And I think this is partly why the entire tech YouTuber space is down. How many videos from people like Jay's 2 Cents have you seen where they're frustrated at the audience yells at them if they make videos on stuff that isn't available, and then they yell at them if they make videos that aren't about the stuff?
Yeah. Oh, yeah, you can't win for losing.
And I haven't made a lot of videos in the past 6 months because I just don't want to hear it. It's not fun for me to cover stuff that you guys can't buy.
Correct.
I mean, I didn't do a review of the 3080 Ti. I didn't do a review of the 3060. I've benchmarked them. But I sat down. I did the 3070 and I did the 3070 versus 2070 versus 1070. And I started to write the script for the 3060, 2060, 1060 comparison.
Yes.
And I just looked at it and I said, well, what's the difference? These are all stupid.
Yep.
I mean, when 2060s are selling for $700
No. It's just
or
boo.
$600, it's
Boo. Boo.
it isn't fun. It isn't fun for us to cover, and it isn't fun for you guys because you guys look at it and go, "What are you supposed to do?"
Exactly. And this is where the biggest issue I have with modern PC gaming is. Like, I'm hearing this all the freaking time from everybody I talk to who either works in the retail space and they're talking to clients and customers, or I'm in, and especially in the repair industry, when I get these clients coming in with these office machines where it's like 8 gigabytes of RAM and like a 4-core chip and maybe, if we're lucky, a solid state drive, I'm just shaking. The client wants to keep their system running for another 4 years. I'm like shaking my head going, you can't. Now, I won't get into that part yet because I want to save that one for a second, but I want to just comment on the fact that this is the reason why I was saying in some of my recent tweets, budget gaming, as it was prior to 2020, is officially dead. Like, in many ways, it's because of multiple factors. Things like inflation, things like manufacturing costs going up, shipping costs going up. I mean, the whole 9 yards. Even when things improve in terms of supply, I still don't expect a lot of these graphics cards to drop up, any fairly significant amount because again, inflation and higher manufacturing costs. So then what is budget gaming on a desktop then? Budget gaming on a desktop is literally going to be $1,300 and more. I mean, maybe if you're lucky and you can get a really good deal, you might find something closer to $1,100, $1,200, but that's still stretching it out a little too much in my opinion. But like all these people who are saying, I don't want to spend over $1,000, it's like, well, I'm sorry to tell you, those kind of budget gaming systems are dead. Unless you're playing old titles. And if all you want to play is old titles, then by golly, go out and get yourself some used components and then call it a day. Because quite frankly, nothing new is going to be that cheap. And for those of you who have this fantasy in your mind that things will actually be better next generation, let me burst your bubble for a second. I'm already hearing whispers of the pricing tiers that are being considered for next generation GPUs. Do you know how much that they are willing to charge to allow you to be able to game just at 1080p alone from this point onward? And by the way, it's not just Radeon considering this. This is also NVIDIA considering this too. Like literally both companies don't want to go any lower than $400. And the thing is that especially with the reaction that was given to the 6500 XT, that in short, yeah, neither company is going that route again on a brand new card. This is why I am saying budget gaming, as it was prior to 2020, is officially dead. You want into PC gaming? You want to be able to play the latest titles? Well, then you're going to have to spend over $1,200 to make that happen. And this is another reason why I think some people are just not interested in the tech space right now, because they're like, well, that's more than what I expected. It's like, well, here's the thing. You're paying for the manufacturers effectively to keep their costs at a semi-reasonable level while still turning a profit. So what else do you expect? What doesn't help this situation overall, and this is one of the reasons why I'm actually getting irritated with reviewers in general, is there is this growing trend where they are still trying to compare MSRP pricing to these new cards that are coming out. Well, first off, number one, let's be realistic. You're literally trying to compare it also against the MSRP values of a lot of these cards that were launched like 2 years ago. What's the point? Because you're essentially like saying it's a bad value proposition that to do 4K that a person has to spend $700. I mean, from where you're sitting, it certainly looks like it. But my question to you is this. Relative to what? A market that no longer is going to exist, even when things do improve in supply? And then you lambast all the companies involved? And then you basically get your viewership base so fired up about the fact that they can't buy something for less than $1,000 that they just basically give up and go to console at that point, and then they end up slightly isolating themselves because of the fact that they can't play with their friends on PC because they weren't willing to dish out the money, maybe when they did have the money. I won't go down that rabbit hole because there's, again, many different details to that topic that would take way too long to cover in this video, and this video is already long enough. But the fact is that the way reviews are done these days, in my opinion, has reached a point to where it is becoming clear to me, even some of the most highly respected tech reviewers out there for the PC gaming hardware industry, I don't think they have a clue what they're really talking about. And I'm not saying it's because they're dumb or anything. These are some very, very smart people. But they don't get that the value proposition of a modern desktop has changed drastically from what it was in 2020 and before. Let me just lay this out on the line. Going back to what I had said about those folks who bring in those office desktops for repairs to Geek Squad, Like, I see it all the time where they're on like 8 GB, 4 cores, or if we're lucky, an SSD. Most of the time, though, it's a hard drive, and they say, "Oh, I want my system to run faster." Well, what do? Well, all I do is check my email and I web browse. Well, what websites do you go to? Oh, I go on to YouTube and then I look up different recipes or, you know, like the stuff you would expect. And it's like, okay, if that's what you do, then your 8 GB of RAM is not going to be enough. Well, what do you mean? It's lasting me this long. No. Let me spell something out clearly. Your system is using components that are at least 4 years old. I'm sorry to tell you that because of the advances that have been made on a software level in recent years, plus add insult to injury with the fact that Windows 11 is not going to run correctly on a lot of those older systems, you're pretty much screwed once Windows 10 is end of life. And so what I've been having to do with these clients is just simply look at the system. And if the system is older than 4 years old, just tell them my personal opinion and say, look, I got your system to run a little faster, but I don't think you should keep it for much longer, even if all you do is office work. I think you should just buy a brand new system. Well, I don't want to spend over $700. Okay, well then you get to keep your system for 4 years for office type work, and then you're going to have to look at one of two things. Either give it more RAM, or just buy a whole new system. The days when you could keep an office machine for at least 7 to 10 years are done and over with. And that's something a lot of those folks don't understand, because in their mind, they think progression is always constant. That's not the case. Technological progression always comes and goes in cycles. We stalled for almost 10 years. Now, all of a sudden, the next 5 years is just going to be massive in performance leaps. So to get back to the tidbit for GPUs, if you're someone who wants to do 4K 144 hertz gaming, then you need to be spending at least, and I mean at least, $4,500. Why? Because that's what the flagship GPUs are going to cost next generation, is almost $2,000. Like when you look at the price tier for tier, basically, you need to think about what it is that you want to do long term and then buy for that, instead of actually just using short-term metrics and hoping it pans out, but instead you end up having to dish out more money than you initially intended just to keep playing games. Welcome to the new mainstream desktop gaming. I mean, this whole thing that people have of, well, I don't like this new thing, I'm going to leave PC gaming. Okay, so you're going to leave PC gaming and go to the consoles? Well, fine. Console cycles typically go and come in like 5 to even 8 year cycles. But you're also limited with what you can do with those. So if you were looking to do any content creation, maybe even get into the more professional space, now all of a sudden you have to go out and buy another machine. So was it actually worth getting that console in the first place? Probably not, because you just added $500 extra on top of now what you've got to go spend money on. Oh, and by the way, did I also forget to mention, you can't even get an office level laptop for less than $700 now. And those come into stock far more frequently and usually have price adjustments that are a little more constant. And, so for me personally, I just don't understand this whole mentality. Like, I get there's an emotional aspect because people like to see things lower in price. You're not going to see those prices again. It's kind of the whole idea of PC gaming has officially changed from here on out permanently. So the question then becomes, how much do you value that time? Do you think it's valuable enough for you to actually go spend the money you need to have a smooth experience and to keep it for a little bit of time? And if the answer is yes, then I applaud you. You're already thinking ahead and you're probably going to do just fine. But if you're one of those people still stuck in like the 2019 mentality where, oh, I'll just I'll stick with my $800 system and just upgrade bits and pieces at a time. Well, you may actually lose out in the end more than you realize. Something to think about, but that's the thing. You either change or you don't. Take your pick. I know for me personally, because a lot of tech reviewers, this concept is just going over their head of what new pricing is going to be like. I'm at the point to where if they are reviewing for, like, let's say a gaming monitor, that is still way more balanced. People don't get nearly as emotional about the monitor. And so then therefore it is much easier for me to find a decent review on a monitor. But for an actual desktop, I'm at the point to where basically I'll watch the performance charts for CPUs and I'll watch the performance charts for GPUs, but I won't actually watch the reviews because the reviews are so out of touch with what pricing is going to look like down the road. And I can't handle it anymore because then those who are looking to this to see, hey, is this actually the deal that I want to go for personally? Well, they're getting led astray because the reviewer is still reviewing his product like as if he's reviewing a product from 2020, 2019, and 2018. That was a different world then. We live in a totally different world today. I don't know what to tell you at that point. That's what I would say to these tech reviewers. And especially since Tech also brings up the point that he's not doing these reviews, mainly because of the fact that you just can't get this hardware easily, I applaud and respect that. I think that's a good position to take, because even when this stuff is much easier to get, again, the pricing is not going to be anywhere near the same as it was in 2020 or 2019. So, you can't have your cake and eat it too. Anyway, this was a bit of a rant and ramble in reaction to this video from Tech Deals, but I think it holds a lot more merit than most people give it credit for. And I can tell you already, most of what he says is very true, because I actually witnessed this happening when I used to work at Micro Center and even now at Geek Squad, when I'm trying to get people's systems to work better, and I'm literally having to show them, hey, what you have is not enough, you need to go better. So, thank you for tuning in to this reaction video. Hopefully you found it informative, and I will see all of you at some point. But in the meantime, go give a like and a subscribe to Tech Deals, because he may not be as active on YouTube right now because of the abysmal conditions of the supply and demand. But once it gets better, be on the lookout for some good reviews from him. And also, on that same note, like and subscribe to this channel. Ring the notification bell so that way you can be notified every single time I get a video up. And enjoy the rest of your day. Peace out.